Mr. Scrooge's health.
And now Tiny Tim will sing to us.
What shall I sing? Hark the heralding.
Yes, hark the heralding.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King, peace on earth and mercy nigh of God.
Well, they're both from London, but little Timmy is certainly no Phil Collins. Of course, we all know and love Little Timmy from Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. But what about his Mistress Carol? Okay, well, maybe there was no carol about her, but you get the point. Imagine that your husband kicks you out of the house. Then your sister not only takes his side, but she continues to live with your husband until he dies. You wouldn't have had to imagine that if you were Catherine Dickens, because that's exactly what happened to her. That's right. Today I have a Christmas hot mess history scandal about your beloved Charles Dickens. The man practically invented Christmas cheer. But when I tell you how he treated his wife for committing the crime of aging, you might not even want to celebrate Christmas again. Okay, you might not take it that far, but maybe National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation will become your Christmas go-to movie over A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens was the moral standard for Victorian men as far as the world was concerned. So it had to have been a hard pill to swallow for a lot of his followers and fans to learn that, at the end of the day, he was just human and downright cruel to his wife of 22 years when he dumped her for getting too old and too fat. Oh, it's a lot. This is the story of a man's meteoric rise to fame, his affair with a teen who was younger than some of his children, another relationship that seemed a little incestuous, and this man's attempt to put his wife away in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. So, Merry Christmas. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up and share to support this video for free. Whether you are watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Now, on to why you are here. This story starts with a burgeoning career and a marriage. In 1835, Charles Dickens was in between writing issues 2 and 3 of the Pickwick Papers, which, when completed, became his first novel. In that same year, he proposed to Catherine, the daughter of George Hogarth, his editor at the Morning Chronicle. They were a loving, affectionate couple. He would often write letters to Catherine, addressing her as my dearest life and my darling pig. And yes, you heard me correctly, pig, P-I-G. I know that it might sound weird to your modern ears. It certainly does to mine. But apparently, during the Victorian era, pet names were often literally animal names. Duck and goose were commonly used as playful, endearing names to call your sweetheart. Pig is one that Charles used for Catherine, but he meant it in a lovey-dovey way. The letters must have worked on Catherine too, because the following year, on the 2nd of April of 1836, the couple got married in St. Luke's Church in Chelsea, London. And here's a brief about their wedding from the very newspaper in which Charles worked for Catherine's father, dated April 4th, 1836. It reads, "Married on Saturday at St. Luke's, Chelsea, Charles Dickens, Esquire, to Catherine, eldest daughter of Charles Hogarth, Esquire, of York Place, Chelsea." This marriage would last for 22 years, and as it drew to an end, Charles would continue calling Catherine a pig, but not in a loving way at all. We'll get there. But the girl that Charles fell in love with was beautiful, kind, intelligent, a gifted musician, and one would have to guess, slim. you'll see that there are a couple of times that Charles makes it clear that he does not like fat women. Beyond all of those great characteristics about Catherine, she was supportive of Charles. She was his biggest cheerleader when it came to his literary career. It was the most important thing going in his life, and I can only hope that Charles didn't marry her to use her for her father's connections. Because her father was a newspaper editor. Catherine was there to stand by her man at every turn, and things started moving fast for Charles after they got married. Almost immediately, Catherine was pregnant with their first child, Charles Dickens Jr., and the rise to fame for Charles had begun. They were navigating all of these changes together. Then in 1837, Charles began serializing Oliver Twist, his groundbreaking novel that established him as a voice for social reform. Just like the Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist was also published in series episodes before it became a novel. Dickens was ahead of his time with this story, too. During his time, novels were vehicles for escapism, and their subjects were light. But here he was, writing about a young boy who was living his life in the darkest of circumstances. From being orphaned and raised in a workhouse to navigating the criminal underworld of London. This was a story that made readers pause and face the harsh realities of Victorian England. Oliver Twist was a scathing critique of what was actually called the Poor Laws, the formal title for the set of laws that were designed to keep poor people in their place was the Poor Act of 1834. You can imagine that this was an uncomfortable subject, to say the least of it. But Charles Dickens confronted it and made the public fall in love with him. He was the people's champ, speaking out against a morally corrupt system. He was their moral authority, and in the minds of many of his followers, he could do no wrong. This angelic perception of him would come to be a problem for his wife when he was ready to leave his marriage. But we're not there yet. As he's writing Oliver Twist, Catherine gets pregnant again and gives birth to their second child, Mary, in 1838. Then Dickens completed the Twist series. Life is good. His career is good. His marriage is good. At least, that's what the public assumes. And it's an understandable assumption because they were taking Genesis 1:28 to heart. In case you're a little rusty on your Sunday school lessons, that's be fruitful and multiply. Just as Oliver Twist is getting into the hands of thousands of readers, Catherine was giving birth to the couple's third child, a girl named Kate, who was born in 1839. Then, 2 years later, comes another. In 1841, their son, Walter Savage Landor Dickens, was born. He was their fourth child. Then, Charles and Catherine took a break from the business of baby making. It was time for Charles to get back to work. And when he did, he came back with the novella that made his name synonymous with Christmas. In December 1843, Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, a novella that would become one of the most enduring and beloved works of his career. Written in just 6 weeks, it was another jab at the social and economic inequalities of Victorian England. Dickens was still deeply concerned about the plight of the poor, particularly children, and A Christmas Carol was him using his pen to confront the issue. The tale of Ebenezer Scrooge's transformation from a miserly, cold-hearted businessman to a generous, compassionate benefactor struck a chord with readers. The same topics strike a chord today. As I'm writing this script in December of 2024, it is mere days after Brian Thompson, a multimillionaire insurance company CEO, was shot to death. The overwhelming tone of the public's reaction was indifference and, in many cases, celebration. Dickens's Ebenezer Scrooge character is a timeless example of art imitating life. And many people see in today's millionaires and billionaires, and certainly insurance companies, characteristics of the untransformed Scrooge. But in 1843, A Christmas Carol is a story of redemption. family, and goodwill. It's heartwarming and it's perfect for the Christmas season. Its success was immediate and profound. Though it was released just days before Christmas, the first edition sold out within weeks. Everyone everywhere was talking about it, and everyone was writing about it. There were briefs about the novella in newspapers everywhere. But in the newspaper where his father-in-law was the editor, the most prominent piece in the literary section was about A Christmas Carol. You can see it here in this 1843 edition of the Morning Chronicle, dated December 19. I don't know if he would have been able to guess the impact that his story's influence would have far beyond his own life and even the lives of his children. But Christmas cheer as we know it today was created in that story. And at the heart of those holiday traditions is family gatherings. Family. And you're about to see that Charles Dickens was way better at writing about family than being a family man. A Christmas Carol added another layer to Dickens as a moral authority. Now, his fans saw him not only as their community hero, he was a compassionate family man. They couldn't help but love him even more. However, as his public persona as a compassionate family man grew stronger, Dickens's private life began to show cracks that would later expose the disparity between his ideals and his actions. And while he valued his public image, maybe more than anything, his next hit novel would foreshadow his dark side and his cruel treatment of his wife. Before that work was published, Catherine would give birth to his 5th, 6th, and 7th children, all boys, Francis, Alfred, and Sidney. With all of those crumb snatchers safely in Catherine's care, Charles Dickens was able to focus his attention on his favorite child, David Copperfield, his semi-autobiographical novel that was a pivotal work in his career. And yes, those were his words, quote, "Like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child. His name is David Copperfield." Between 1849 and 1850, Charles Dickens is serializing David Copperfield. Much of it is the story of his life, a young man navigating the challenges of an often unforgiving world. It's a story about hardship, ambition, and personal growth. It mirrors Dickens's own rise from humble beginnings to literary fame. This was a man who knew his audience and he knew how to win them over. He gave them a story about perseverance in the face of adversity. His readers were dealing with adversity from many angles. The everyday Victorian had to learn how to get along in the face of rapid industrialization, class struggles, and shifting social norms. If you swap out technological advances for rapid industrialization, those are the same changes that we're facing today. So imagine that someone writes something or makes a video that helps you to make sense of a world where you feel stuck or like you can't keep up. But whatever this person wrote or said gave you the hope that you could become a success and make it through all of the confusion. That's what Charles Dickens did for his Victorians with David Copperfield. The novel was a smash hit. Somehow, Dickens had managed to outdo himself, and his fame continued to grow to unbelievable levels. To understand his fame in his own time, think of those images of the Beatles landing in the USA and everybody calling it the British invasion. Or the footage of grown men crying and fainting at the sight of Michael Jackson in the 1980s. Dickens wasn't just a writer. He was the rock star of literature. He was the voice of the Victorian era. He, at this time, is famous. Catherine is pregnant. She has 2 more of their children while Charles is writing the series and later publishing it. A boy named Harry and a girl named Dora. Like Charles Dickens, the David Copperfield character lived a childhood that was marked by financial instability. David Copperfield had to work in disturbingly harsh conditions after his mother died, and Charles Dickens had to do the same when he was a young boy. Let me take a break from the David Copperfield parallels to Dickens' life and tell you a little more about the life of Charles Dickens. Details that I believe will help you to understand his actions later in life, and we're getting to those nitty-gritty parts in just a second here. So it seems that Charles lived a pretty decent life for a good portion of his childhood. Everything changed because his father, John Dickens, was living beyond his means and racking up debt. It all caught up with him when Charles was 12 years old. John, his father, and Charles's mother were sent away to a debtor's prison. So were Charles's younger siblings, and just like that, he had no family. And because he was, according to the law of the land, old enough to be out on his own, Charles was sent to work in a dark, dank, disgusting blacking factory where the conditions were beyond deplorable. I'm talking about rotting floors and rats all over the place. Absolutely sickening. The place was called Warren's Blacking Warehouse. It produced and bottled liquid shoe polish. Now, Charles only worked there for about a year, and it's easy for me to say only a year. But for him, it was the worst year of his life. During that year, the warehouse relocated to a busy district, and this new location had a window where the boys worked. That window looked out onto a very public and crowded street where passers-by would look in on Charles and the other boys like they were a freak show exhibit. This was the definition of adding insult to injury, and it only ended when Charles's grandmother, his father's mother, died. For in her will, she left him a little more than he needed to pay off his debts. Getting that money and making those payments allowed John Dickens and his wife and small children to be released from debtor's prison. It also allowed John to get Charles, take him out of that warehouse and bring him home with his family. But there was an objection to Charles leaving the warehouse, and that objection came from his own mother, Elizabeth Dickens. She told her husband that Charles should have to stay there and work a bit longer. Eventually, he got to leave and was sent off to a school that he really didn't care for. So even though that was just 1 year, you can see how that 1 year would help to shape him into the man he became. That year left him emotionally scarred. That's where he developed his sensitivity to the fate of abandoned children and his rage at social injustice, themes that were constant in his literary works. That year of his life also gave him his insatiable desire for financial security. He left Warren's Blacking Warehouse knowing that he could never be satisfied being poor because the world was cruel to poor people. And the horrid conditions of that warehouse left him yearning for tidiness more than the average person. If it had been a thing back then, people would have said that Charles Dickens had OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. As a father and husband, this was a man who would conduct inspections of his children's bedrooms as if he were a military sergeant. He would completely rearrange furniture when he stayed in hotels so that everything was always in its proper place, as he saw it. He was also known to always have a comb at the ready just in case a hair got out of place. And being humiliated while working in that window and being gawked at by the public turned him into someone who was obsessed with his public image and would never be humiliated again if he had a say. And because of how his mother treated him, he developed a disrespect for women that he could not shake. In his own words about his mother's decision to make him stay at the Blacking Warehouse, quote, "I never afterwards forgot. I never shall forget. I never can forget that my mother was warned for me being sent back." End quote. And he's talking about being sent back to that warehouse to work. And yes, this story is about him today. But you all know on this channel we hold everyone accountable. Charles happens to be a man who did some wrong things that we're going to get into, but his mother was totally in the wrong and out of line for not welcoming her son home with the rest of the family when she could have. And he didn't forget it, but it seems like he decided to make Catherine pay the price for his mother's sins. Now, let's get back to David Copperfield. David prioritizes his career over family. So does Charles Dickens. David's marriage fails, and it's the fault of his wife, Dora. She's just too immature for the successful novelist, David. She doesn't know anything about managing a household or finances. She's just a silly little woman. There are some critics who believe that Dickens was projecting his hatred of Catherine onto his Dora character. It seems to be more widely accepted that the Dora character is inspired by Dickens' first love and Victorian women in general. But it's fiction, so he had the creative freedom to mix and match storylines. Anyway, in the story, Dora dies. Then Dickens, David, goes on to marry the woman he wants, a more suitable match, the perfect domestic companion. Am I suggesting that Charles wanted Catherine to die? I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that he wanted her out of the picture. And he might have had his eye on at least 3 women who could have been a better fit for him. Before I tell you about those ladies, I have to tell you about one more coinky-dink when it comes to Dickens and David Copperfield. After David's wife dies, he is happy to find that his younger associate, Agnes Wickfield, is available for courting and loving. She's a beautiful friend from an earlier time in his life. Now, let me tell you about Maria Beatnell, a beautiful friend from an earlier time in his life, Charles Dickens' life. She was his real-life first love. They met in 1830 when Charles was 18. He was head over heels in love with her. She thought that he was okay. Her parents thought even less of him. It was 1830, so their opinion mattered a great deal. At the time, Charles was a court stenographer. Maria's father was a banker, and in his mind, Charles's career was not impressive enough for him to consider Charles as a good and suitable match for his daughter. But that didn't stop Charles from pursuing her. He tried his best to impress her family and threw himself a coming-of-age party when he turned 21. He invited the Beatnell family, and they accepted his invitation. This was his moment to get some alone time with Maria. He took her off to a private corner and expressed his love for her. She laughed in his face and called him a boy. Well, of course, that ended their relationship. She went on to marry someone else, and we know that eventually Charles did too. But they met again later in life. After Catherine had finished giving birth to all 10 of Charles's children, and while Maria was still married. Here's how it happened. In 1855, Charles Dickens reached out to Maria. At this point, he was disillusioned with his marriage to Catherine. So he did what any logical, mature man would do. He wrote about his poor excuse of a wife to his ex-girlfriend. Behind Catherine's back, he wrote to Maria about everything that he hated about his wife. That was bad enough, but to make matters worse, he let Maria know that he longed for the nostalgia of their youthful romance. To Maria, he wrote as though he were the same infatuated 20-year-old man who had once been captivated with her charms, painting a picture of her as the one who got away. Maybe Charles didn't have any expectations when he sent those letters to Maria. After all, she was still married. But, to his surprise, she wrote back and he was beyond delighted about it. So he wrote back to her. You see, the letters she sent to him were destroyed, but the letters he sent to her were not. Here's an excerpt from a 1911 edition of the Sydney Mail that talks about what was contained in some of those letters that were discovered by an American collector named Mr. Bixby, and later edited by a Harvard University professor named George Pierce Baker. The beginning of the section of that story that is called A Tragic Meeting reads, quote, Maria seems to have written explaining that she would have married Dickens if it had not been for her parents, and he replied with simple and touching emotion in one of the most remarkable letters ever written. He refuses to believe her when she says that she is now toothless, fat, old, and ugly. He recalls how her eyebrows had a tendency to join together. Now I'm pausing on this quote for a moment because it sounds like what he's saying is that maybe she had a unibrow and he thought that that was really attractive. Anyway, back to this quote. He had always been reminded of her when a girl played the harp. Maria had asked for an interview, and again, he heartily responded. He promised to buy presents in Paris for her little girl. Then, alas, they met. Alas and alas, for his eyes no sooner fell on the object of his old passion than it shivered and broke to pieces. Sir Robertson Nicholl suggests that Dickens wrote of her in Little Dorrit, where he is Arthur Clennam, she is Flora Finching. If so, the interview was a dreadful disillusionment. End quote. We'll get to Little Dorrit. In the meantime, this is what the Victorian family man wrote to his first love in his second letter to her. He told her that he had, quote, got the heartache again from seeing her handwriting and, quote, whatever of fancy, romance, energy, passion, aspiration, and determination belonged to me, I never have separated and never shall separate from the hard-hearted little woman, you, whom it is nothing to say I would have died for. That I began to fight my way out of poverty and obscurity with one perpetual idea of you. I have never been so good a man since as I was when you made me wretchedly happy. End quote. Now, depending on the source you read, some say that she told Charles that she wanted to have a private meeting with him. Others say that he asked her to meet with him. Whoever asked for the meeting, they both agreed to attend and that it needed to be a secret rendezvous that their spouses could not know about. Charles loved the idea and agreed to the meeting. Now, Maria also warned Charles that she was not the same girl he met when they were much younger, and that was understandable to Charles. 25 years had passed. He certainly wasn't the same either. He was in his 40s now and had done a lot of living since his 21st birthday. He was excited to see where things could go now that he wasn't just a stenographer. This time around, he had everything to offer Maria. He was so much more than he was before. And much to his surprise, so was Maria. She was so much more in terms of her weight. She had nearly doubled in size, and Charles was not pleased or attracted. It turned out that she wasn't lying after all about being old, toothless, fat, and ugly. The tables had surely turned. All of a sudden, Catherine wasn't looking so bad to Charles. She was still a 3 out of 10, but at least she had all of her teeth. He met Maria one more time for a dinner, with both of their spouses present. She made it clear that she wanted to continue talking to Charles, but he was done. The fantasy was over, and he cut off communications with her completely. Maria's appearance shattered the idealized image he had held on to for so many years. It was to the point that it seemed like he was angry with her for not still looking like a teenager. He couldn't get over it. He wrote letters to his friends telling them how disgusting Maria was and was dismissing her as extremely fat and no longer attractive. But his pen didn't stop there. He had to tell his fans about it too. Remember that I told you that I'd get back to Little Dorrit? Well, that was another one of his series that was adapted into a novel. He started writing it in 1855, the same year he met with Maria. And wouldn't you know it, after meeting with Maria, he has a character named Flora Flinching. And she's fat. Flora is portrayed as a middle-aged woman whose appearance and mannerisms starkly contrast with the youthful beauty she once possessed. Surprise, surprise. Her interactions with the main character are laced with awkwardness and unfulfilled romantic expectations. Flora is Maria. She talks too much and she weighs too much. This character's existence is not a coincidence. It is Charles Dickens being disrespectful to another woman because she was a chatty fatty who had the nerve to not meet his standards so that he could cheat on his wife with her. Flora's depiction in the novel is often seen as cruel, a very thinly veiled caricature of Maria that underscores Dickens's fixation on physical appearance. Charles was a man who had every tool in his arsenal that a brilliant writer needed, and he used those tools effectively to create some of the best writing that the world has ever experienced. Yet, he stooped to the decision to make this literary low blow. It really gives us a look at his more mean-spirited tendencies, particularly toward women who no longer fit his ideal. As he got older, his preoccupation with youthfulness didn't go away. It always crept its way into his writings and into his real life, unfortunately for Catherine. Speaking of Catherine, let me tell you about the too close for comfort relationship that Charles Dickens had with Georgina Hogarth. Do you remember that Catherine's maiden name is Hogarth? Yeah, well, Georgina is Catherine's sister, her younger sister, of course. Georgina moved into the Dickens household in 1842. At the time, Catherine was 27. Georgina was only 15. She essentially took on the role of helping Catherine to manage the household and care for the children. The arrangement started off great. By that time, Catherine had 4 children under the age of 7. You can imagine that she was happy to have the help. But here's the thing. Helping out at the Dickens household was merely an added benefit that Georgina provided. Her whole reason for leaving her parents' home at the age of 15 and moving in with Catherine was to gain access to the social connections the Dickens had, because Georgina needed to find a husband. Well, she didn't spend any time looking for one. She spent all of her time right there in the Dickens house. As time went on, Georgina's bond with Catherine weakened, and oddly enough, at the same time, Georgina became increasingly close to Charles. I'm sure you can imagine that people thought that was strange. So they started talking. Rumors were flying around left, right, and center about the inappropriate relationship that Charles Dickens was having with his younger sister-in-law. She had come to London to find a husband, and it looked like she had found one. Her sister's. I mean, the girl received some marriage proposals, but she turned down all of them. The only man in her life was Charles Dickens. And as he pushed Catherine further away, Georgina drew closer to him, taking his side in disputes against Catherine. And I'm not suggesting that he necessarily slept with her. What I am saying is that Charles and Georgina were closer than you would want your sibling to be to your spouse. Take that however you want. The people who knew Charles up close didn't like the look of this relationship with his sister-in-law. The more they talked about it, the more serious it got. This situation was bigger than tea room chatter. It got so out of hand that Charles had to address it publicly. By this time, it's 1858. 3 years after his plans to cheat on Catherine with his ex-girlfriend fell apart. Charles was physically separating from his wife, and he made the process unbearable and humiliating. In phase 1, he showed off his handyman skills. Remember how I told you he would rearrange furniture in his hotel rooms? Well, that was nothing compared to what he did to his own bedroom that he shared with Catherine. He divided their room into half and boarded up the connecting door. Catherine could not enter his half, and he did not want to go into her half. Now, in his heart and mind, they are officially separated. Eventually, he moved her into another place to live while he stayed at home with the children. The reason that the heat got turned up on the accusations that he was having an affair with his sister-in-law is that when Catherine got put out, Georgina stayed. So now, under Dickens's roof were his younger children, Georgina, and himself. From the looks of it, he had created the family he wanted by pushing out his fat old wife. It sounds like a plot from a Jerry Springer episode, but this was his real life, and he had to defend himself. I found the letter that he begged to have released to the public in an 1858 issue of the Kingston Daily News, and I'm going to share a few parts with you. Hang on to your seats because you're about to find out what Charles really wanted to do with Catherine, and it is despicable. This is Charles Dickens airing out his marital problems. And he's only motivated to do so because public opinion is weighing heavily in Catherine's favor. This letter is his attempt at saving face. He gave it to his manager, Arthur Smith, along with instructions to, quote, show it to anyone who wishes to do me right, or to anyone who may have been misled into doing me wrong, end quote. I'm going to show you the whole letter on the screen, but share with you these parts. Quote, Mrs. Dickens and I have lived unhappily together for many years. Hardly anyone who has known us intimately can fail to have known that we are, in all respects of character and temperament, wonderfully unsuited to each other. Here he goes on to defend Georgina, quote, nothing has, on many occasions, stood between us and a separation but Miss Dickens's sister, Georgina Hogarth. From the age of 15, she has devoted herself to our house and our children. She has been their playmate, nurse, instructress, friend, protectress, advisor, and companion. And the manly consideration towards Mrs. Dickens which I owe to my wife, I will merely remark of her that the peculiarity of her character has thrown all the children on someone else. I do not know, I cannot by any stretch of fancy imagine what would have become of them but for this aunt, who has grown up with them, to whom they are devoted, and who has sacrificed the best part of her youth and life to them. And here's where he reveals his plot to rid himself of Catherine. Quote, for some years past, Mrs. Dickens has been in the habit of representing to me that it would be better for her to go away and live apart, that her always increasing estrangement made a mental disorder under which she sometimes labors. More, that she felt herself unfit for the life she had to lead as my wife, and that she would be far better away. End quote. A mental disorder under which she sometimes labors. Let me tell you, Catherine Dickens did not suffer from any mental disorder. But this was Charles Dickens's plan to get rid of his wife by saying that she had a mental disorder and sending her away to live the rest of her life as an inmate at an insane asylum. I can't express just how cruel and twisted this scheme of his was. It was 1858. A man could say that his wife was insane and have her committed to a mental institution quite easily in those times. God forbid that a wife not provide sex as often as her husband wanted or prepare a meal that he didn't like. She might find herself coming down with a mild case of schizophrenia, for which her husband would have had to send her away for treatment. Often those mental disorders would clear up when the household chores got out of hand and hubby needed a little assistance with cleaning, cooking, and laundry and whatnot. But you see, the household of Charles Dickens was never going to be out of order. He had Georgina and a staff of servants. If he could get Catherine put away in an insane asylum, it would be a life sentence. He would never need her again. If he got his way, Catherine's future was going to be worse than that 12th year of his life working in the blacking factory. Remember, the year that shaped his hatred of mistreatment of the poor? Well, insane asylums weren't regulated in the 1850s. He knew that he was sending Catherine to spend the rest of her days in a facility that was known for poor, filthy conditions, physical abuse of patients, and overcrowding. The man who was getting rich off of standing up for people in his literature didn't mind sending the mother of his children to live the rest of her life in misery because she had committed the crime of getting fat after having 10 of his children. So he used his massive influence to reach out to Dr. Thomas Harrington Tuke of Manor House Lunatic Asylum. Dr. Tuke wasn't just any ordinary doctor. He was famous in his own right, and he was a sought-after alienist whose opinion mattered a great deal in a number of high-profile lawsuits. It was his job to determine if someone was mentally sane at the time of committing a crime. He was a highly esteemed psychiatrist. So, if Charles Dickens could get Dr. Tuke to give the medical opinion that his wife was insane, it was good riddance to Catherine. Well, unfortunately for Charles, Dr. Tuke actually possessed ethics. From all appearances, Dr. Tuke actually was the decent and moral man Charles Dickens pretended to be. He refused to lie and say that Catherine had a mental disorder, wrecking whatever plans Charles had to destroy Catherine's image and move on with another woman without receiving even more public backlash. With that rejection from Dr. Tuke, his plot to send Catherine away was over and done. No psychiatrist in his right mind would give an opinion contrary to Dr. Tuke's. Now, Charles was exposed. His carefully cultivated, virtuous Victorian image was nothing more than a facade. As far as anyone could tell, he was just a really good writer who was as dirty on the inside as any of the villains from his novels. He was not able to put Catherine away, and he was so angry about it. Like a petulant child, he resorted to throwing tantrums and name-calling. By the 1860s, he's publicly referring to Dr. Tuke as a, quote, wretched being and a, quote, medical donkey. His actions following his split with Catherine were weird, to say the least. He initiated the separation, yet he was also the one acting like a woman scorned. In June of 1858, he published a statement in his journal called Household Words. Apparently, he was addressing the situation regarding Catherine, but his language is so coded and defensive that the words mean nothing. He refers to his issues as some domestic trouble and proceeds to write a bunch of gibberish about how he was concerned for the sake of the public that they might be looking at him in an unfavorable light. Reading that long statement almost made me forget that he was one of the best writers in history. He was trying to defend himself, but wasn't even man enough to say what the accusations against him were. But his childish behavior didn't stop there. Charles Dickens used this period also to sever ties with his friends who supported Catherine. You know, the same way that middle school girls do. If you're going to be friends with me, you can't be friends with girls I don't like. This is how this 46-year-old man was carrying himself. But it wasn't just friends he was cutting off. Dickens lost business contacts too, because some of them sided with Catherine. You know, the whole not wanting her to be put away into an insane asylum,
when she clearly did not belong in one.
Notably, he ended his relationship with William Bradbury and Frederick Evans. Who were these two guys? They were better known by their business name, Bradbury and Evans Publishing. They were his publishers. Well, Charles approached them with a very immature idea, and they turned it down flat. He asked them to publish a statement in their periodical called Punch. Now, Punch is a magazine that had significant cultural importance. It was the biggest satirical magazine in the country. It introduced and popularized the word cartoon. So you can imagine that when Charles went to them and asked them to publish a statement about his old fat wife, that his motive was to further humiliate Catherine. Punch magazine made light of serious issues sometimes, but this request was just taking things too far. This request of his wouldn't produce comedy, but instead the public ridicule of a woman who didn't deserve it. In Charles's mind, Punch served him a gut punch by not publishing his low-brow, low-blow dig at Catherine. So, in his usual crybaby fashion, he didn't want to play with them anymore. It must have been so difficult for his serious business associates to have to handle this grown, successful man the same way they had to handle their children.
Speaking of children,
It's time for me to tell you about Ellen. She is the teenage actress he met in 1857, the year before he needed to get Catherine out of his house. It certainly seems like his aim was to move Catherine out and to move Ellen in. Here's their story. In 1857, Charles and his friend Wilkie Collins were working on a stage play that they co-wrote. It was called The Frozen Deep. Charles was overseeing casting for the play, and that's how he met Ellen Ternan. She was an actress who came to audition for a role, and Charles was captivated by her from the moment he saw her. This is what he was hoping he would see when he met his first love behind Catherine's back. A woman who was young, beautiful, and slim, of course. Ellen was everything that Catherine wasn't. Catherine was an overweight slob who was making him look bad in public, but with a piece of eye candy on his arm like Ellen, he would get looks and stares for the right reasons when he showed up to industry parties. This match made sense because she was so good-looking, and so was he. But seriously, in his mind, it only made sense that a hot young babe should be seen next to him. I can't stress enough how important his image was to him and how superficial he was. He felt entitled to a young woman like Ellen. The play she was in was a success. Everything in his life was a success. At this point in his life, Dickens had the Midas touch. Whatever he touched turned to gold. Perfection. And that's what Ellen was. Perfection in the human form. He was perfection, and he deserved to have the chance to wipe the slate clean and to get rid of Catherine and start over with this perfect woman who fit perfectly into his perfect life. Now, he doesn't just want Ellen. He needs her. And it is during this time in his life that he becomes increasingly mean to Catherine. She has to go because his affection for Ellen has spiraled into a full-blown obsession because she is just what he's been looking for all of these years. The perfect replacement for Catherine. This obsession with Ellen consumed Charles till his dying day, and you'll see exactly what I mean by that shortly. He was so busy trying to please Ellen and buy her affection that it didn't matter that his personal life was in shambles all around him. He couldn't see it. He could only see Ellen. So everything that I just told you about the year of 1858, when Charles is doing carpentry work to separate his bedroom space from Catherine and throwing temper tantrums because no one agrees with his attempt at putting Catherine in an institution, all of this is happening while he's trying to date, pursue, court Ellen. He turned up the heat on his hateful tactics towards his wife because he had his next woman lined up. By 1859, this relationship has turned into a bit of a public scandal. The man was a brilliant writer, but not good at covering his tracks. It was written about in an 1859 edition of the Castlemaine Mail. Quote, "By recent accounts, we have received further scraps of information respecting the family discords of this great writer and austere moralist. On paper, it appears that incompatibility of temper which caused a separation after 22 years of married life between Mr. Dickens and his wife, had its first origin in a Miss Ellen Ternan, a very young and beautiful actress, for whom he entertained what he was pleased to consider a platonic affection, but which it does not appear other persons were disposed to view in that light. His eldest son, now a man himself, has sided with his mother in this matter, and prefers residing beneath her roof to his father's. This circumstance, with others, has told strongly against Dickinson's version of the story at home. We also hear from our London correspondent that Dickens is about to abandon his management of Household Words, having quarreled with his publishers Bradbury and Evans, because these gentlemen refused to insert his statement, which had appeared in that journal, in the pages of Punch. Mr. Leach, the artist, Punch's mainstay, threatened that if that statement appeared, he would never draw another line in its pages. End quote. But this did not stop him. After this, he went on to buy Ellen a townhouse. Yes, by 1859, Charles's relationship with Ellen Ternan had deepened to the point of scandal. Now he was calling her Nellie and working tirelessly to conceal the affair. This same year, Ellen moved into a townhouse, which he paid for, and she retired from acting. I mean, she had given the theater all that she could have given it. She was 20. Isn't that around the age you retired? Well, maybe, just maybe, she was able to retire because he was helping her out financially. And by helping, I mean paying for her existence. He was so determined to keep her that he would do anything. And what he had to do was keep their relationship under wraps. So the townhouse that he bought for Ellen was purchased under the names of her sisters, Maria and Fanny Ternan. Quick side note about sisters, Maria and Fanny were far more talented than Ellen. They both went on to have successful careers as actresses and writers, both of them. They were determined and just as beautiful as Ellen, but many of Dickens's critics believe that it was Ellen's lack of determination and talent that attracted Charles to her. He wanted someone who would follow his will and never object or challenge him. That's what he got in his Nellie. And he tried everything within him to keep their secret relationship going. It was kind of easy for him. He had more than enough money to maintain multiple residences, and he did, so he could have her stowed away at one place and then another. The travel schedule that he had to maintain also made him hard to track, so he definitely could bring Ellen on trips with him. There was probably no man on earth happier with the invention of railroads than Charles Dickens. Train tracks gave him an easy escape from the watchful eyes of London, where everyone knew who he was and, for the most part, still pitied Catherine. Even though he was divorced by 1858, he was not able to go out flaunting Ellen in public. He wanted his fans to believe that all of the stuff about Ellen was a lie, so he had to keep her a secret for the rest of his life. I would imagine that eventually, people got around to not caring about his affair one way or another, but because he cared so much about his image, he continued to sneak around with Ellen. He took her to Paris several times in the 1860s. Sometimes her mother would accompany them on their train rides. Ever trying to keep up his charade, he would tell people that Nellie was his stepdaughter when they were on these trips. And that plan worked fine until June 9th, 1865. On that day, Dickens was returning from a trip to Paris. In the coach with him were Ellen Ternan and her mother, Frances. The train track was being repaired near Staplehurst. Workmen didn't signal to the oncoming train that there was a gap in the tracks, and that was a major problem. The gap was 42 feet long, and it was over a bridge. The train's engineer spotted the trouble at the last minute, but it was too late. Momentum carried the engine and the first part of the train across the breach. But you can imagine the rest. The coaches in the center and the rear of the train fell into the river below the bridge. All but one of the first-class coaches went into the ravine. That coach was the one that carried Charles Dickens, Ellen Ternan, and her mother. The story made front-page news, the Staplehurst railway crash. 10 people died and nearly 50 people were injured. Even if Charles Dickens hadn't been aboard, the story would have gotten major press coverage. But since he was on the train, it got even more coverage, and the extra coverage was about him. First, let me give credit where it's due, because one man said that Charles saved his life. His name was Dickinson. Other witnesses reported that he acted bravely and he did his best to aid his fellow passengers. Those same witnesses reported that after he got out of the rail car, he helped Ellen and her mother get out too. I've never seen fate work so hard against a man who was trying to live a double life. Well, that was June 9th, 1865. On June 9th, 1870, the 5th year anniversary of this train wreck, Charles Dickens died. The Middleburg Post wrote the earliest story about it that I could find. Their June 10th edition described Dickens's death. According to their story, on Wednesday, June 8th, Charles was at a dinner. All was well. And then he started having fits. His family physician, Dr. Steele, was summoned and arrived immediately. He cared for Charles until the wee hours of Thursday morning. His condition only worsened, so Dr. Steele made the decision to call for more help. Telegrams were sent to doctors all over London, and one by one, they started arriving at Gad's Hill, one of Dickens's many residences. Very soon it became clear that this was not about which doctor had the most experience or knew the newest techniques in medical science. They had a consultation and all came to the conclusion that saving Charles was a lost cause, and he'd be dead before the next day. They were correct. His condition gradually sank until he drew his last breath at 6:15 a.m. at the age of 58. It seemed to happen out of nowhere. He had been mildly ill in the weeks that led up to his death, but nothing so serious that anyone thought that he would die. But that's how fleeting life is, isn't it? I know that it's not a surprise to you that the nation went into mourning as the news spread. Queen Victoria sent a message of condolence to the family, and all public institutions suspended business for the day as a mark of respect. Well, I found his will. And I don't think that it will surprise you to learn that the first person he listed in his will was Ellen Ternan, his sweet Nellie. Now, I didn't expect that Catherine would be first on this list, but Ellen before his own children? This guy had it bad for her. His will starts, quote, I, Charles Dickens of Gadshill Place, Hyen, in the county of Kent, hereby revoke all my former wills and codicils, and declare this to be my last will and testament. I give the sum of £1,000, free of legacy duty, to Miss Ellen Lawless Ternan. End quote. This £1,000 payment is nothing to sneeze at. It's got the buying power of roughly $160,000 today. After naming 2 more people by name, then stating what he'll provide for all of his domestic servants, both male and female, he then lists one of his children, his daughter Mary. And that's understandable. She was the only unmarried daughter. He left her £300 per year until she wed. After her, he names his favorite sister-in-law, Georgina. Let me share with you his words to her. Quote, I give to my dear sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth, the sum of £8,000, free of legacy duty. I also give to the said Georgina Hogarth all of my personal jewelry, not hereinafter mentioned, and all the little familiar objects from my writing table and my room, and she will know what to do with those things. I also give to the said Georgina Hogarth all my private papers whatsoever and wheresoever, and I leave her my grateful blessing as the best and truest friend man ever had." End quote. He left Charles Dickens Jr. and his son Henry an £8,000 trust to manage. One of their responsibilities was to invest some of the money in order to keep providing for the family. And here's another moment where I have to give him credit. As horribly as he treated Catherine, part of that trust he left to his sons was to care for her until she died. And that's great. But honestly, it's the least that he could do after putting her through hell and humiliating her. He thought that his money and stature would buy him the favor of the public. It didn't work. But his connections and power did allow him to shut Catherine up and never have her side of the story to be heard. At least that's what he counted on. But you know the saying, what is done in the dark will come to the light. And for Catherine, that light came in 2019 when her own words had been discovered. Or I should say rediscovered. Here's the deal. In 2014, Harvard's Haunton Library purchased a number of Dickens-related documents at an auction. The letters weren't analyzed until 2019 by John Bowen. But by this time, the general public had forgotten about Dickens's scandals, or they never knew. To the average person, he I shall get all right again. I cannot write a long letter, but I must just express my most affectionate good wishes of the season, although the new year will be in some time before ye receive this. I trust, dearest Plorn, you are well and happy. I am thankful to think you have had good rains. I cannot tell you the devoted love and kindness I receive from all my dear children in my illness. God bless you, my own Plorn. Your always loving mother. Even as she is utterly ill and her children chose to distance themselves from her, here she is reaching out to her son to express her love to him and to give him hope that they'll meet again soon. Well, that hope was false. Catherine died the following November, the 22nd of 1879. She was 64 years old. Obituaries were printed in newspapers everywhere. And like most women of her time, and even later, she was chiefly remembered for being her husband's wife and the mother of his children. By the time that Catherine died, 3 of the Dickens children had already passed. The baby Dora, who died at 8 months, their son, Sidney, who had a respectable naval career but lived his adult life in debt, which Charles Dickens absolutely despised about Sidney and some of his other children. Sidney died at the age of 25 while returning home on sick leave. Their son Walter rose to the rank of lieutenant of the East India Company. His promising future fell apart when he, also, got deeply into debt. Then he got ill, had an aneurysm, and died at the age of 22. Charles Dickens Jr. started his adult life as a banker, then, to his father's dismay, went bankrupt, and only got on his feet after his father hired him to write reference books, Charles Dickens reference books. Mary went on to live with Georgina after her father died. Kate was their only daughter who really pushed back hard against Charles when he went on his campaign to humiliate Catherine. She married twice, first to a younger brother of Wilkie Collins, who had worked with Charles Dickens in the past. Then she married the Italian painter Carlo Perugini. Francis ended up joining Canada's Southwest Mounted Police and dying 1 year after his retirement. Alfred also started his adulthood in debt. After his Australian wife died in a horse carriage accident, he became a single father to their 2 girls and earned a living lecturing about his father. Henry went on to have a successful law career and was knighted in 1922 by King George V. Edward, the baby of the family, joined his brother Alfred in Australia and became a member of Parliament in New South Wales. For all of the despicable behavior of Charles Dickens when it came to his wife, that is only a small part of his legacy. He was a horrible husband and a magnificent writer. Virtues seemed to be important to him, but maybe he just didn't like the thought of applying those virtues to himself. That would make him a hypocrite, but still a damn good writer. This is the man who gave us Ebenezer Scrooge. And he gave Mr. Scrooge something that he didn't give himself when it came to his cruel treatment of his wife: a redemption arc. Scrooge saw the errors of his ways and fixed himself, which made people love him. Charles Dickens doubled down on his pathetic behavior and tried to rewrite history and force people to love him, as they had when he was their champ. His readers learned lessons from his novels, but it seems like he never did. Charles Dickens only killed Catherine's spirit while pretending to be a good person. Doris Duke, on the other hand, actually killed a person while she used her charitable giving as a tool to make people see her as a good person. She was a total hot mess, and I published a story about her crazy wife that you can see here. I'll also leave links to it in the description box and pinned comment of this video. My sources for this story are listed on the screen. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, Me and my new YouTube channel, Verified YouTube Guide. Are you just starting your YouTube journey and feeling overwhelmed? Don't worry, I've got you covered. My channel, Verified YouTube Guide, is your go-to resource for practical, step-by-step tips to grow and monetize your channel. It's literally follow-along video tutorials. I'm showing you the steps I took to get 180,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you don't know how to do something, you can just copy my work one step at a time. From setting up your channel to showing you how you can earn money at any stage on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about YouTube ad revenue. If you have something important to say or a service to sell, start talking about it on YouTube now. Don't wait. Subscribe to Verified YouTube Guide today, and let's build your channel together. You don't have to figure this out alone. The link is in the description box. I'll see you there.